At 0430 hours on the morning of August 15th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Yasuo Fujimori stood in the conning tower of the submarine the 519, drifting silently 300 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, 80 miles northeast of Guadalcanal. The submarine had been at patrol depth for 6 hours, conserving battery power, listening to the distant rumble of American convoy screws through the hull-mounted hydrophones. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The I-19 was one of the most advanced submarines in the world. She displaced 2,198 tons submerged, carried 94 crew, and was armed with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft. She could dive to 330 feet, cruise for 16,000 nautical miles on the surface, and maintain 14 knots submerged for over an hour. By any measure of submarine technology in 1942, she was a masterpiece of naval engineering. But Lieutenant Commander Fujimori was staring at a problem that had nothing to do with his submarine's capabilities. Spread across the small navigation table in the cramped control room were patrol reports from the previous 3 months. Reports from I-15, I-17, I-25, I-26. Dozen of attack runs. Torpedoes fired at ranges verified by periscope observation. Targets confirmed. Explosions heard or observed. And then, nothing. Ships steaming away, undamaged. The numbers were impossible to ignore. The 1st Submarine Squadron, operating out of Guadalcanal, had fired 173 torpedoes between May and August of 1942. The confirmed sinking total was 14 ships. That was an 8% success rate. 8%. For every 12 torpedoes fired, 11 missed or failed. These were not green crews firing at extreme range in rough seas. These were veteran submariners, graduates of the rigorous training program at Cura Naval Base, firing at ranges between 800 and 1,500 meters. Textbook engagement distances. The kind of shots that should have been hitting 70–80% of the time, according to pre-war doctrine. But something was catastrophically wrong. And that something was the Type 93 oxygen-powered torpedo, the most sophisticated torpedo in the world, and the Type 95 torpedo used by submarines, which shared the same fundamental design philosophy. The Japanese had spent 15 years developing these weapons. They had invested millions of yen. They had created a propulsion system so advanced that no other navy possessed anything comparable. They had solved problems that American and British engineers said were impossible. And in doing so, they had introduced a flaw so fundamental, so subtle, that it would cost Japan the war in the Pacific before most officers even realized the problem existed. To understand what went wrong, you have to go back to 1926 to a small research facility at the Kure Naval Arsenal, where a young engineer named Rear Admiral Toshihide Asakuma was trying to solve a problem that had plagued torpedo designers since the weapon was invented. Range and speed. Every torpedo was a compromise between these two factors. You could build a fast torpedo that ran out of fuel quickly, or a slow torpedo that could travel long distances. But you could not have both. The limitation was chemistry. Torpedoes in the 1920s used compressed air to drive their engines. Compressed air is only 21% oxygen. The rest is nitrogen, which does nothing except take up space in the pressure flask. If you could remove the nitrogen and use pure oxygen, you could carry much more oxidizer in the same volume. More oxidizer meant more fuel could be burned. More fuel meant longer range or higher speed, or both. The problem was that pure oxygen is violently reactive. It combusts explosively when exposed to oil, grease, or even certain metals under pressure. Engineers in Britain and the United States had experimented with oxygen torpedoes and concluded they were too dangerous to deploy. The risk of accidental detonation during handling was unacceptable, but Asakuma believed the problem could be solved with rigorous material selection and handling procedures. He spent 7 years developing the Type 93 torpedo. Every component that came in contact with oxygen was made from specially selected alloys: copper-nickel for the fuel tanks, aluminum-bronze for the valves. Even the lubricants were specially formulated to be oxygen-compatible. The result was extraordinary. The Type 93 could travel 43,000 meters at 36 knots, or 20,000 meters at 48 knots. By comparison, the American Mark 15 torpedo, the standard surface ship weapon, could manage only 5,500 meters at 45 knots, or 13,700 meters at 26 knots. The Japanese torpedo had nearly 4 times the range at comparable speed. For submarine use, the Navy developed the Type 95, a smaller version of the same oxygen propulsion system. It could travel 9,000 meters at 49 knots, or 15,000 meters at 45 knots. These were astonishing numbers. Submarines could fire from ranges where American destroyers could not effectively retaliate. Surface ships could launch torpedoes from beyond visual range and hit targets that did not even know they were under attack. The tactical implications seemed revolutionary. Japanese doctrine envisioned using these long-range torpedoes in coordinated night attacks by destroyer squadrons and in submarine ambushes of American fleet units crossing the Pacific. The thinking was straightforward. American ships would be steaming in formation at 12 to 15 knots. Japanese submarines would position themselves along the expected route. When American ships appeared on the horizon, the submarines would fire spreads of 4 to 6 torpedoes from 6,000 to 8,000 meters away, well beyond the effective range of American sonar or depth charges. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The torpedoes would run silently through the water, nearly impossible to detect because they left no visible wake. Oxygen combustion produces only water vapor and carbon dioxide, not the white bubble trail created by compressed air torpedoes. By the time the American lookouts realized they were under attack, the torpedoes would already be seconds from impact. Multiple ships would be hit simultaneously: cruisers, destroyers, transports. The American formation would collapse into chaos, and the Japanese submarine would slip away, completely undetected, to reload and attack again. This was the theory. The vision that justified 15 years of research and millions of yen in development costs. And in isolated tests, under controlled conditions, the torpedoes performed exactly as designed. Test firings at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal between 1935 and 1941 showed consistent performance. Torpedoes traveled the predicted distances, maintained accurate depth control, and detonated reliably on impact. But test conditions are not combat conditions, and the engineers at Kure had overlooked something fundamental about how submarines actually attack ships at sea. The flaw was not in the oxygen propulsion system. It was in the depth control mechanism. Every torpedo has a device called a depth engine, a mechanical system that uses a hydrostatic valve and a pendulum to maintain the torpedo at a preset depth below the surface. When the torpedo goes too deep, the valve senses the increased pressure and adjusts control surfaces to bring it back up. When it runs too shallow, the valve adjusts the opposite direction. The system worked perfectly in calm water. But the Pacific Ocean is not calm. Ships moving at 15 knots create wakes. Destroyers, cutting through the ocean at 25 knots, create turbulence that extends 20 to 30 feet below the surface. Convoys traveling in formation create overlapping wave patterns. Multiple ships maneuvering create chaotic water conditions that change every few seconds. The Type 95 torpedo's depth engine, calibrated and tested in the still waters of Yokosuka Harbor, could not compensate for these conditions fast enough. When a torpedo entered turbulent water, the depth engine would overcorrect. The torpedo would dive deeper than intended, pass beneath the target ship's keel, and continue harmlessly into the deep ocean. Or it would rise too close to the surface, breach momentarily, lose speed and stability, then plunge downward in an uncontrolled dive. The problem was made worse by the Prex torpedo's exceptional speed. At 49 knots, the Type 95 was moving through the water so fast that the depth control system simply did not have time to make fine adjustments. By the time the hydrostatic valve sensed a depth change and adjusted the control surfaces, the torpedo had already traveled 50 meters in the wrong direction. American torpedoes, which were slower, had more time to correct depth errors. Their mechanical systems could respond before the torpedo deviated too far from the target track. But the Japanese torpedo was too fast for its own control system. The engineers had optimized for speed and range. They had not adequately tested for depth stability in realistic sea conditions. The result was catastrophic in practical terms. Submarine commanders would line up perfect shots, range confirmed by periscope, target speed calculated by stopwatch timing, lead angle computed using the standard attack tables, fire control solution entered into the Type 97 torpedo calculator, a mechanical computer that was itself a marvel of precision engineering. Everything would be correct. The torpedo would leave the tube with a compressed air ejection charge, the oxygen engine would ignite, and the weapon would accelerate to attack speed. The submarine crew would hear the torpedo motor through the hull, a high-pitched whine that faded as the weapon sped toward the target. Then, silence. No explosion. The periscope watch would see the target continue on course, undamaged, and the submarine commander would be left staring at empty ocean, wondering what had gone wrong. In the early months of the war, submarine commanders blamed themselves. They assumed they had miscalculated the target speed, or misestimated the range, or entered the wrong gyro angle. After-action reports were filled with self-criticism. Torpedo spread poorly calculated. Failed to account for target evasion. Insufficient lead angle. But by mid-1942, the pattern was undeniable. Too many experienced commanders were reporting the same problem. Perfect attack geometry. Torpedoes fired. No hits. The submarine force headquarters in Tokyo began collecting data systematically. They analyzed hundreds of attack reports, looking for common factors. What they found was terrifying. The torpedoes were not missing left or right. Directional control was working correctly. The torpedoes were missing vertically. They were running deep, passing beneath targets that should have been hit. Or they were running shallow, porpoising through the surface, visible to enemy lookouts, easily avoided by a simple turn of the wheel. The depth control problem had existed from the beginning, but it had been masked during peacetime testing. Test torpedoes were fired at stationary targets or at ships moving in straight lines through calm water. Under those conditions, the depth engine worked adequately. But real combat involved ships zigzagging, seas running at 3 to 5 feet, wakes from, multiple vessels, destroyer escorts charging through the convoy, creating massive turbulence zones. Under those conditions, the Type 95 torpedo was nearly useless. The success rate should have been 60 to 70%. Instead, it was 8%. The implications rippled across the entire Japanese submarine fleet. The submarines themselves were excellent. The crews were well trained, the tactics were sound, but the weapon they carried could not reliably sink ships, and in submarine warfare, that meant everything else was irrelevant. A submarine that cannot sink ships is not a warship. It is a very expensive, very vulnerable scout craft. And Japan had built 63 fleet submarines by 1942, all of them carrying torpedoes that ran incorrectly more than 90% of the time. The mathematics were brutal. Japan was fighting a war that required destroying American shipping faster than America could replace it. American shipyards were producing merchant vessels at an accelerating rate. Liberty ships, simple welded freighters, were being built in an average of 42 days by late 1942. Japan needed to sink 2 to 3 merchant ships per month, per submarine, just to break even with American production. With an 8% torpedo success rate, that was mathematically impossible. Even if every submarine made perfect attacks, even if they penetrated convoy screens and achieved ideal firing positions, the torpedoes would not perform. The weapon that was supposed to give Japan a decisive advantage in submarine warfare had become a catastrophic liability. And the worst part, the truly devastating part, was that fixing the problem was extraordinarily difficult. The depth control mechanism was not a simple component that could be swapped out in a field modification. It was an integral part of the torpedo's design, calibrated to work with the oxygen propulsion system's specific thrust characteristics and speed profile. Redesigning the depth engine meant re-engineering the entire torpedo. That required months of testing, new manufacturing tooling, retraining of maintenance crews, and retrofit of existing inventory. All of this had to happen while fighting a war, while submarines were at sea, carrying defective weapons, while American convoys steamed unmolested toward Guadalcanal, delivering troops, food, ammunition, and fuel that would ultimately push Japan back across the Pacific. In August of 1942, Lieutenant Commander Fujimori did not know any of this technical detail. He knew only what the patrol reports told him. Something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. And men were dying because of it. Not just American sailors who should have been sunk but survived. Japanese submariners who were ordered to press attacks, to close range, to fire multiple spreads when the first torpedoes failed. Submarines that should have been able to attack from safe distances were forced to penetrate close to convoy escorts, exposing themselves to depth charge attacks because the long-range torpedoes did not work. The I-19 herself would survive 1942 and 1943. She would sink the aircraft carrier USS Wasp and the destroyer USS O'Brien in September of 1942, one of the most successful submarine attacks of the war. But those successes came at close range, barely 1,200 meters, where even defective torpedoes occasionally hit. The long-range capability, the revolutionary advantage that was supposed to define Japanese submarine warfare, never materialized. And across the Pacific, in 62 other Japanese submarines, the same story was repeating. Perfect attacks, torpedoes fired, ships surviving. A design flaw measured in inches of depth deviation, costing Japan hundreds of merchant ships that should have been sunk, thousands of tons of supplies that should have been stopped, and ultimately, the strategic initiative in the Pacific War. The realization that the torpedoes were fundamentally flawed did not come as a single moment of clarity. It came gradually, reluctantly, through the accumulation of failure after failure, until denial was no longer possible. In September of 1942, the Naval Technical Bureau in Tokyo convened an emergency investigation panel. They called it the Torpedo Performance Review Committee, a bureaucratic name that masked the desperation behind its formation. The committee was led by Captain Tamotsu Nakano, a torpedo specialist who had worked under Rear Admiral Asakuma during the original Type 93 development. Nakano was 51 years old, a career engineer who had spent his entire adult life working on torpedo technology. He understood the weapons at a level few others in the Navy could match. When he reviewed the combat data, he saw immediately what the problem was. The depth control mechanism was oscillating. In still water, the oscillations were minimal, barely noticeable. The torpedo would deviate 6 inches above or below the set depth, well within acceptable parameters, but in turbulent water, those oscillations amplified. The torpedo would swing 2 feet deep, then 3 feet shallow, then 4 feet deep, in increasingly wild fluctuations. By the time the torpedo reached the target, it could be running 10 to 15 feet deeper than the set depth, or it could be porpoising at the surface. The target ship's draft, the depth of its hull below the waterline, determined whether a hit was possible. A deep-running torpedo would pass completely beneath a destroyer, which typically drew only 15 feet. It might hit a transport, which drew 25 to 30 feet, but only if the depth deviation was not too severe. Nakano calculated that approximately 35% of torpedoes fired in combat were running too deep to hit anything smaller than a cruiser. Another 20% were running so shallow they were visible at the surface, giving target ships time to maneuver. Only 45% were running in the correct depth band, and of those, many were missing due to other factors like incorrect range estimation or target evasion. The committee's report, completed in October of 1942, was classified top secret and distributed only to senior naval staff. It stated plainly that the Type 95 torpedo required immediate modification to the depth control system. The report estimated that fixing the problem would take 4 to 6 months of engineering work, followed by 3 months of testing, followed by production of new depth control units and retrofit of existing torpedo inventory. Total time to fleet implementation, approximately 1 year. The Navy General Staff read the report and made a decision that would haunt Japan for the rest of the war. They decided not to halt submarine operations while the torpedoes were fixed. They decided not to inform submarine commanders of the specific technical problem, and they decided not to divert industrial resources from other weapons programs to accelerate the torpedo fix. The reasoning was coldly strategic. Japan was fighting on multiple fronts: Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Aleutians. Every one of those campaigns required ships, aircraft, ammunition, fuel. The Navy could not afford to pull submarines out of service for 6 months while torpedoes were rebuilt. And informing commanders that their primary weapon was defective would, the staff believed, damage morale and reduce aggressive action. So the submarines stayed at sea, carrying torpedoes that failed 90% of the time, and the commanders kept attacking, kept firing, kept wondering why their perfect shots were not sinking ships. The human cost of this decision is difficult to quantify precisely, but we can trace the outlines through specific incidents. Consider the case of the I-26, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Minoru Yokota. On November 13, 1942, I-26 was patrolling off the coast of Guadalcanal when Yokota spotted a formation of American transports. 7 ships, escorted by 3 destroyers, steaming at 12 knots. It was a textbook target. Yokota maneuvered into attack position, calculated the firing solution, and launched 4 torpedoes at staggered intervals to cover the convoy's width. Range was 2,000 meters. Sea state was calm, visibility excellent. The torpedoes left the tubes, the oxygen motors ignited, and the weapons accelerated to attack speed. Yokota watched through the periscope, counting seconds, waiting for explosions. Nothing happened. The convoy continued on course. The destroyers did not react. No ships took evasive action. The torpedoes had missed completely, passing beneath the transports without detonating. Yokota surfaced after dark and radioed his report to headquarters. He assumed he had made a calculation error. He did not know that all 4 torpedoes had run 8 to 12 feet too deep. 2 days later, Yokota found another target. A single American cruiser, the USS Juno, limping away from the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The Juno had been damaged by a torpedo from the destroyer Amatsukaze during the night battle. She was traveling at 13 knots, barely making headway, escorted by 2 destroyers. Yokota closed to 1,500 meters and fired a single torpedo. This time, the weapon ran true. The Type 95 struck the Juno on the port side, directly beneath the forward magazine. The explosion was catastrophic beyond anything Yokota expected. The Juno did not sink gradually. She detonated. The entire ship, all 6,000 tons, disintegrated in a single massive blast that sent a geyser of water and debris 300 feet into the air. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the bow section completely out of the water before the ship vanished beneath the surface. 700 men were aboard. Only 10 survived. The irony was brutal. Yokota had fired 5 torpedoes in 3 days. 4 had failed completely, 1 had worked, and it had killed 700 men in seconds. That was the reality of the Type 95 torpedo in combat. When it hit, it was devastating. The 600-pound warhead, filled with Type 97 explosive, could break a cruiser in half. But it hit so rarely that even experienced commanders could not predict success. The inconsistency was psychologically destructive. Submarine commanders could not build confidence in their weapons when success seemed random, and they could not adjust their tactics because they did not understand what was causing the failures. Some commanders began firing larger spreads, 6 or 8 torpedoes per attack instead of 2 or 3, hoping that sheer volume would produce hits. But this exhausted torpedo supplies faster. Submarines had to return to base for resupply after only 2 or 3 attacks instead of 5 or 6. Other commanders closed range, attacking from 1,000 meters or less, where even depth control problems were less likely to cause complete misses. But closing range meant penetrating escort screens. It meant exposing the submarine to depth charge attack. It meant higher risk for crews who were already operating under extreme stress. The I-1, commanded by Commander Eiichi Sakamoto, attacked a convoy off New Georgia in January of 1943. Sakamoto closed to 800 meters and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 5 missed. 1 hit a transport, but the ship did not sink. It was towed to Tulagi and repaired. Destroyers charged toward the submarine's position, sonar pinging. Sakamoto crash-dived to 300 feet, but the destroyers had a solid contact. For the next 4 hours, the I-1 was hunted through the depths. 37 depth charges were dropped. The submarine's hull groaned under the concussions. Light bulbs shattered. Insulation rained from the overhead. Cork fragments filled the air. Men stood at their stations, silent, waiting to die. The I-1 survived, barely. She limped back to Rabaul with a cracked pressure hull and traumatized crew. Sakamoto reported that the attack was successful, 1 transport damaged. He did not report that 5 torpedoes had missed, because he did not know why they had missed, and admitting failure would reflect poorly on his command. This pattern repeated across the submarine fleet. Commanders downplayed failures, emphasized successes, and the Naval General Staff continued to believe that submarine operations were more effective than they actually were. By March of 1943, the Torpedo Performance Review Committee had developed a partial fix. They redesigned the depth engine with a heavier pendulum weight and a more responsive control surface actuator. The modifications reduced depth oscillation by approximately 60%. Not perfect, but significantly better. Production of the modified depth control units began in April, but retrofit was slow. Each torpedo had to be disassembled, the old depth engine removed, the new unit installed, then the weapon tested. Only 4 torpedoes could be modified per day at the Kure arsenal. Japan had approximately 3,000 Type 95 torpedoes in inventory. At 4 per day, complete retrofit would take 2 years. The Navy tried to accelerate the process by establishing additional modification facilities at Yokosuka and Sasebo. But trained technicians were scarce. The specialized tools required for torpedo disassembly were in short supply, and submarines could not wait at dock for weeks while their entire torpedo load was rebuilt. The compromise was to issue modified torpedoes gradually, mixing them with unmodified weapons. A submarine departing on patrol might carry 12 torpedoes, 4 modified and 8 original. Commanders were told to use the modified torpedoes first, but they were not told how to identify which torpedoes were which. The weapons looked identical externally. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Commanders could not learn from experience because they did not know which torpedoes were reliable and which were not. A successful attack might have used an unmodified torpedo that happened to run correctly by chance. A failed attack might have used a modified torpedo that the commander then assumed was defective, like the old ones. The feedback loop that should have helped commanders adapt their tactics was completely broken. Meanwhile, the strategic situation was deteriorating. American submarine warfare in the Pacific was becoming increasingly effective. Not because American torpedoes were better designed. The American Mark 14 torpedo had its own catastrophic problems with depth control and exploder mechanisms throughout 1942 and early 1943. But because American commanders were more aggressive about identifying and fixing problems. When American submarine skippers reported that torpedoes were running too deep, the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington initially denied the problem. But by mid-1943, after repeated complaints and documented failures, the Bureau conducted live fire tests against netted targets. They discovered the Mark 14 was running 10 feet deeper than set depth. The fix was simple: an adjustment to the depth control mechanism's calibration. By September of 1943, every American submarine in the Pacific had properly calibrated torpedoes. Success rates improved dramatically. American submarines began sinking Japanese merchant ships at rates that exceeded Japan's ability to replace them. In 1943 alone, American submarines sank 284 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 1,300,000 tons. Japanese submarines, by contrast, sank 57 Allied merchant ships in the same period. And most of those sinkings were accomplished by submarines that had closed to point-blank range, essentially surface attacks where depth control problems were minimized. The disparity was not due to courage or skill. Japanese submariners were every bit as capable as their American counterparts. The disparity was due to weapons that worked versus weapons that did not. Consider the mathematics from Japan's perspective. In 1941, before the war began, Japan's merchant fleet totaled 6 million tons. To supply the military operations across the Pacific and to transport oil from the Dutch East Indies and raw materials from Southeast Asia, Japan needed approximately 4 million tons of merchant shipping in continuous operation. That meant Japan could afford to lose, at most, 2 million tons before supply lines became critical. In 1942, American submarines sank 580,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. In 1943, that number rose to 1,300,000 tons. By the end of 1943, Japan had lost 1,880,000 tons, leaving only 4,120,000 tons in service. The margin was razor-thin. And in 1944, American submarine effectiveness would increase again, sinking 2,400,000 tons. Japan's merchant fleet would collapse completely by early 1945. Now, imagine if Japanese submarines had been even half as effective as American submarines. If the Type 95 torpedo had been fixed in early 1942, instead of languishing with a known defect for 18 months. If Japanese submarines operating from Rabaul, Truk, and Kwajalein had been sinking American transports at anything approaching the rate American submarines were sinking Japanese merchants, the strategic calculus of the Pacific War changes dramatically. American logistics across the Pacific were already stretched. Every Liberty ship sunk meant fewer supplies reaching Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Gilberts. Every troop transport sent to the bottom meant delayed reinforcements, reduced offensive capability. Japanese submarines in 1943 fired approximately 800 torpedoes at Allied shipping, with an 8% success rate that produced 64 hits. If the torpedoes had worked correctly, with a 60% success rate that competent submariners should have achieved, those 800 torpedoes would have produced 480 hits. Not all hits sink ships, but even assuming a conservative 30% sinking rate, that's 140 ships sunk instead of the actual 57. An additional 83 ships sunk in 1943. That's over 500,000 tons of shipping removed from Allied supply lines. That's 20 divisions worth of supplies not delivered. That's fuel oil not reaching forward bases, aviation gasoline not reaching airfields, ammunition not reaching artillery batteries. The American advance across the Pacific did not stop, but it slows. Operations are delayed, casualties increase, the timeline extends, and that extension is what Japan desperately needed. Not to win the war, the industrial disparity made Japanese victory impossible in any extended conflict, but to create conditions for a negotiated settlement. Every month, the war continued in 1943, and 1944 was a month American industrial production accelerated. But if Japanese submarines had forced the Americans to divert resources to convoy protection, to build more escorts instead of more landing craft, to route shipping along longer, safer paths instead of direct routes, the cumulative effect would have been significant. This is what makes the torpedo failure so tragic. It was fixable. The technology to correct the depth control problem existed. The engineers knew what was wrong and how to fix it by October of 1942. But institutional inertia, bureaucratic pride, and strategic miscalculation prevented rapid implementation. The Naval General Staff did not want to admit that 15 years of torpedo development had produced a weapon that failed in combat. They did not want to divert resources from battleship construction and carrier air groups to something as unglamorous as fixing torpedo depth engines. And they genuinely believed that the submarine force was performing adequately because commanders were not reporting the true extent of the failures. By the time the modified torpedoes were widely distributed in late 1943 and early 1944, the strategic situation had shifted. American air superiority over much of the Pacific made submarine operations increasingly dangerous. Japanese submarines that had operated with relative freedom in 1942 were being hunted by American destroyers, equipped with improved sonar, and by patrol aircraft, with radar. The I-19, the submarine that Lieutenant Commander Fujimori had commanded in August of 1942, was sunk by the destroyer USS Radford on November 15th, 1943. The I-26, which had destroyed the USS Juneau, was sunk by the destroyer USS Farragut on October 24th, 1944. The I-1 was destroyed by New Zealand corvettes on January 29th, 1943. Of the 63 fleet submarines Japan possessed in December of 1941, only 14 survived the war. The rest were sunk, averaging approximately one submarine lost per month throughout the conflict. The crews, The veteran submariners who had trained for years were irreplaceable. Unlike surface ships, which could be crewed by hastily trained recruits, submarines required experienced men who understood the complex systems and could operate effectively under the psychological stress of depth charge attack. Every submarine lost was a loss of institutional knowledge that could not be recovered. By 1945, the remaining Japanese submarines were crewed partially by men who had never conducted a combat patrol. The expertise that had defined the submarine service in 1941 had been bled away through attrition. There is a particular conversation that illustrates the tragedy of this entire situation. In March of 1945, as the war was collapsing around Japan, Captain Tamotsu Nakano, the engineer who had led the Torpedo Performance Review Committee, was interviewed by a junior officer compiling lessons learned for post-war analysis. The junior officer asked Nakano when the Navy had known that the torpedoes were defective. Nakano stated that the problem was understood by September of 1942. The officer then asked why submarines had continued operating with defective weapons for over a year before the fix was fully implemented. Nakano's response was documented in the post-war records. He said that the decision was made at levels above the technical staff. The engineers had recommended immediate retrofit, but the operational commanders believed that losing submarine combat capability during a retrofit period was strategically unacceptable. It was more important, they argued, to keep submarines at sea, attacking, even with reduced effectiveness, than to pull them from combat for repairs. The junior officer then asked the question that cuts to the heart of the matter. How many ships were not sunk because of this decision? Nakano did not answer immediately. He calculated silently, then stated that based on torpedo expenditure data and projected success rates with corrected weapons, Japanese submarines probably failed to sink between 150 and 200 Allied ships due to torpedo defects, 150 to 200 ships, each one carrying troops, fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, each one representing American combat power delivered to forward areas. Each one a target that should have been destroyed but survived because a mechanical device deep inside a torpedo oscillated too wildly in turbulent water. The officer's final question: could fixing the torpedoes sooner have changed the outcome of the war? Nakano's answer was carefully measured. He said that Japan could not have won a prolonged war against the United States regardless of torpedo performance. American industrial capacity was too great. But, he added, effective submarine warfare might have delayed American advances by 6 to 12 months. That delay might have allowed Japan to negotiate from a stronger position. It was not victory, but it was a less catastrophic defeat. And it was lost because of a design flaw measured in inches, because of a bureaucratic decision to delay fixes, and because of institutional reluctance to acknowledge that a weapon system built with 15 years of effort and national pride was fundamentally inadequate. Commander Minoru Yokota, who had commanded the I-26, survived the war. His submarine was sunk in 1944, but Yokota was ashore on staff duty at the time. In post-war interviews, he consistently stated that Japanese submariners were well-trained and aggressive, but they fought with one hand tied behind their backs. He did not elaborate in public, but in private conversations with fellow veterans, he was more direct. He said the torpedoes were garbage, and everyone knew it, but no one was allowed to say it officially. Captain Nakano also survived and worked in Japan's post-war industrial reconstruction. He never spoke publicly about the torpedo program, but he kept personal notes that were discovered after his death in 1974. In those notes, he wrote that the Type 95 torpedo represented the best and worst of Japanese engineering. The oxygen propulsion system was a legitimate technological achievement, But the failure to adequately test depth control under realistic conditions was an unforgivable oversight. He wrote that engineers had been pressured to deliver a weapon that met performance specifications for range and speed, but that actual combat effectiveness was never rigorously evaluated. The Navy wanted a miracle weapon. The engineers delivered specifications that looked miraculous on paper, and when combat revealed the truth, institutional momentum prevented rapid correction. Lieutenant Commander Yasuo Fujimori, who had stood in the I-19's conning tower in August of 1942 reading patrol reports and recognizing that something was deeply wrong, did not survive the war. The I-19 was sunk by the destroyer USS Radford. Fujimori went down with his submarine. He was 41 years old. He left behind a wife and 2 children in Yokosuka. In his personal effects returned to his family, there was a letter he had written but never sent. In that letter, he described his frustration with weapons that did not work and orders that required him to keep attacking despite failures. He wrote that submariners were not afraid of death, but they wanted their deaths to mean something. To die attacking enemy ships that then sailed away unharmed because torpedoes ran too deep, that was a death without purpose. That was waste. The letter was dated October 3rd, 1942, 1 month after the Torpedo Review Committee had confirmed the defect, 13 months before the I-19 was sunk. Fujimori spent the last year of his life fighting with weapons he knew were defective, following orders from officers who knew the weapons were defective, in a system that could not bring itself to stop operations long enough to fix the problem. This is the real story of Japan's torpedo failure. Not a tale of engineering incompetence, the Japanese were excellent engineers. Not a story of cowardice, the submariners were brave to the point of fatalism. It is a story of institutional failure, of bureaucracies that prioritize appearance over function, of military organizations that cannot admit error quickly enough to correct it, and of strategic planning that sacrifices effectiveness for the sake of maintaining operational tempo. The mathematics are simple and brutal. 800 torpedoes fired in 1943, 64 hits with defective depth control, potentially 480 hits with corrected depth control, 150 to 200 ships not sunk, hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies delivered to American forces that should have been resting on the bottom of the Pacific. The outcome of the war was not determined by this failure alone. Japan faced insurmountable disadvantages in industrial capacity, resources, and strategic position. But the torpedo defect was a self-inflicted wound that made defeat more rapid and more complete than it needed to be. When nations build weapons for 15 years and then fail to test them adequately under realistic conditions, when military organizations prioritize pride over effectiveness, when bureaucracies delay fixes because admitting error is embarrassing, the result is not just tactical failure, it is strategic catastrophe. Japanese submariners paid for that catastrophe with their lives, attacking ships they could not sink with torpedoes that did not work, dying in submarines that were hunted down by escorts that should have been avoiding torpedo attacks instead of hunting submarines that posed no real threat. Wars are decided by logistics, by industrial output, by resources, but they are also decided by whether your weapons work when you pull the trigger. Japan built the fastest, longest-range torpedoes in the world, and they ran at the wrong depth 90% of the time. That is the arithmetic of defeat. Everything else is just the working out of mathematical inevitability. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.